Okay, I'm delighted to be chairing and moderating this discussion with Pranab Bardhan. Doesn't really need an introduction, but he's Distinguished Professor of Economics at University of California at Berkeley. Has long been a leading voice in development economics and political economy, international trade. Pranab has been one of my heroes and idols in the economics profession. I first got to know him through his work in international trade, which was highly technical, but it was for those of us younger people in the discipline, kind of an exquisite examples of how to do applied theory work to shed light on development and fundamental issues of the real world. And Pranab has really spanned an extraordinarily wide range of issues beyond international trade, on political economy of development, on a lot of his work has been on agricultural development, issues of collective goods provision, infrastructure, water, irrigation. And he has not been shy also in expanding, sort of taking on very big topics like China, India's diverse or different growth paths. And most recently, in this excellent book published by Harvard University Press, which is going to be the focus of our discussion today, A World of Insecurity, Democratic Disenchantment in Rich and Poor Countries. And I'm really looking forward to this. This book is thin, but packs a lot of real good stuff in it. I like it especially because it spans both the advanced countries and the poor countries, sort of looks at these problems of democratic malfunction in the North and in the South. And I think does a great job of integrating what now has come to be called the two schools of thought on the rise of right-wing authoritarianism, sort of the economic schools versus the cultural schools, sort of looking for the roots of this economic anxieties on the one hand and cultural splits on the other. So I'm going to give Pranab some 10 minutes or so to tell us a little bit about the highlights of the book. Then we're going to engage in a discussion, and then we'll open up for some discussion from the floor as well. Pranab, welcome.
Thank you, Danny, for those over-generous remarks. Actually, much of my professional career, I've been writing technical books, theoretical as well as empirical. But more recently, particularly, I have now retired in Berkeley, even though I go to campus quite often. I decided, particularly in the COVID period when I was isolated, mostly at home, I wrote two books. One is this, which is a very general book. In fact, it's meant for a general readership. It does not have a single chart. It does not have a single equation. And it does not have a single footnote. But it's really very, very wide in its... Of course, there are many books on this subject, on democratic disenchantment, as I call it. There are quite a few books in the market. So let me product differentiate my book in four respects. One is, as Danny already emphasized, most of the books are on either US or Europe or both. I think one of the few books that in the market now, one of mine would be essentially it addresses both rich countries and developing countries. And in developing countries, although I talk generally, but I also talk specifically about three developing countries. One is India, one is Turkey. Have we started talking about
Turkey is fine.
And Bolsonaro's Brazil. So those are the three specific cases I take up a little more than the other developing countries. So that's point number one of product differentiation. Second, is that much of the literature, particularly from economists, and my friend Thomas Piketty has gone gaga on that, is that it's all due to inequality. Now, I think inequality levels have reached grotesque levels in my judgment. And it's extremely important, but I personally think on the democratic disenchantment, inequality may not be always the primary reason behind worker anxiety and rage that people talk about. And I give reasons. In fact, a couple of chapters of my book are on this inequality issues and other issues, which may sometimes be more important. Given the title of the book, you can imagine that I emphasize insecurity. When I talk about, and I say this quite often, workers really don't, contrary to what the occupation people will tell you, the workers don't really want what the top 1%, they don't have an idea what the top 1%, what they do. They're more worried about insecurities in their own life. And by insecurities, by the way, this is also the second point of differentiation. Part of the second point of differentiation, I talk about both economic insecurity and cultural insecurity. Economic insecurity is, of course, job losses, income losses, could be due to trade shocks, could be due to automation, and things like that. In fact, more probably due to automation. But I spend a great deal of time on cultural insecurity because it's somewhat unusual for economists to talk about it. I already talked about these two schools. And particularly in some contexts, the inequalities enforced is somewhat strange that the right-wing extremists are the workers are rallying under the banner of plutocrats, whether it's Trump or in the Brexit case, in the original leader, one of the original leaders, Nigel Farage. Victor Orban is a billionaire. Marine Le Pen in France is a billionaire. Erdogan is a plutocrat, very rich. India's Modi is not wealthy himself, but he's posing with billionaires. So the inequality, and one of the few things, one of the immediate things some of these leaders, right-wing leaders do after coming to power is lower the taxes of the rich or relax the regulations, business regulations, including environmental regulations. So that's the second point of product differentiation. The third is I give quite a bit of space to China. In fact, there's a whole long chapter titled The Temptation of Authoritarianism. Is China an alternative model? And in my judgment, it is not. China has some very strong points, strengths. The chapter is largely on the governance system. China has very strong points. My judgment is that these strong points, for these strong points of governance, authoritarianism is neither necessary nor sufficient. And there are some weaknesses of China, the Chinese governance system, which I would say primarily due to authoritarianism. The ugly features are primarily due to authoritarianism. So that's the third point of product differentiation. The fourth is that half of the book is really about policies. And there, given my political prejudices, I really call for what I call rejuvenation of social democracy. But social democrats in the last few decades have quite often been discredited in different parts of the world. And I go into a little bit of why. And the rejuvenation, I have certain things in mind, how to rejuvenate, etc. Particularly improve labor's voice in governance. That's one aspect of it, but I go over a whole range of policy issues in the second half of the book. So the first half is more about understanding, diagnosis, etc. The second half is policies there. I think let me stop here. And one of the things that I would like to discuss, if you're interested, is that I didn't want to bring it up in the first 10 minutes, is I think in the diagnosis part, it is important, very important to understand inequality or even insecurity, economic insecurity. These are left-wing issues. So one of the issues, why are workers turning right? To me, that is and the first half of the book, I go into that. I just want to tell you that that's an important question, in my opinion.
Thank you, Mara. I actually want to pick up on the point that you left with, but before I do that, let me try to deepen this discussion on the economic versus cultural roots of the democratic discontent. And just I want to understand exactly how you see that. Now, let me put my cards on the table. Like most economists, actually, I put much more emphasis on economic anxiety, and I completely agree with you that it's not inequality per se, but something that maybe you say it's economic insecurity, sometimes there's economic anxieties, but this is not inequality per se. So the people who've been flocking to the right are not the poorest, and the poorest are not necessarily not the worst. It's really the middle classes and the low middle classes where we've seen these issues rise. But in the case of economic explanations, we can identify certain shocks that have inflamed these insecurities. So you have, of course, the China trade shock that my colleague here, Gordon Hanson, and others have looked at. So you have, these labor markets are shocked by this onslaught of imported goods from the United States, from China, and people lose their jobs. As they lose their jobs, they start voting for outsiders. Or you have automation, the introduction of new technologies that have adverse effects on employment. Or you have, in the case of Europe, the austerity that followed the financial crisis. In the case of in Britain, that inflames the pro-Brexit vote and so forth. What would be the corresponding shocks on the side of sort of the cultural, the rise of cultural identity politics? Or alternatively, might it be that that's also being driven indirectly by these economic shocks? Do you see this cultural phenomenon as independent, driven by other shocks, or is it a derivative of these economic shocks?
Right. Actually, I recently, you probably have already seen it, some of you may have. Martin Wolf, the Financial Times journalist, has written a big tome of a book, many times my book. It's called Crisis of Democratic Capitalism. And there he's taking the position that culture is important, but it's derivative of the economic thing. And by the way, he's not talking developing countries, he's taking only rich countries. I did a long review article of that book recently in Boston Review, if you are interested. And I'm not strongly in disagreement, but I'll tell you the points that I made in that article in relation to this particular question. So, if from the economic point of view, the economic shocks point of view, you will then therefore expect the right-wing to be more in areas which were left behind. Whether it's the Rust Belt in the United States, whether it's the Midlands in England, similar Rust Belts in continental Europe, you expect that. But you don't see that in Ukraine. And particularly, let me give you from Europe, and then I'll talk about developing countries. Let's take one of the most astonishing cases of rise of extreme right-wing in Sweden, of all countries, in Mecca of social democracy. Okay. And by the way, Sweden turned to extreme right after the book came out. Let me talk about. So
This is out of sample.
but let me give you some data about Sweden. So Sweden, if you take the period 2005 to 2014, the proportion of households which in that period had either flat real income or falling real income, that's economic part. In Sweden, it was about 20%. If you take the 25 advanced countries, the average is about 65%. Sweden is an outlier in the economic shock wave. Okay? Much less shock in Sweden. And yet, they have now turned to a party, it's not running the government, because there was an agreement that they will not run the government, but it's the main party back in the government, which is Nazi roots. It goes back to, it has explicit Nazi roots. So that's an example from continental Europe. Just one more example. Again, it's not, for example, Martin Wolf suggests you will expect this right-wing thing, reaction in these left behind areas. But even in Italy, the Northern League is part in the advanced area of Italy, not the backward area of Italy. If you go to developing countries, let me first go to the developing country I'm from, India. Even in rich countries, you see some of the support of the right wing is older, less educated, rural. In India, it's sometimes the opposite. You see this right wing extremism among urban, aspirational youth, and quite often they're quite well off. I mean, not the very poor, not the very rich, but they're well off. If you take a left behind areas, right wing is very strong in India, in Gujarat, one of the industrially the most growing areas, the Karnataka, industrially very affluent areas, Maharashtra, one of the strongest in terms of industrial affluence. So I see these exceptions to the general. But then your question was about the cultural shock. I don't think it takes the form of a shock, but it's a kind of cultural alienation. Of course, culture being different in different countries, it takes different forms. I would say in Europe, it's immigration. Even that with the party, the Nazi route in Sweden, it is the immigration is the main thing. Immigration can be an economic factor too, but it's not the economic shock of immigration, that's the cultural shock of immigration. In the United States, the safety net being much more patchy than in Europe, at least Western Europe, you see both culture and economic shocks together. But the immigration, as Trump always emphasized, was a very important part of that. And Trump's followers all the time talked about immigration. In fact, there's a book by a sociologist, a colleague of mine in Berkeley, a sociologist, Arnie Hochschild. She had a book, in fact, before Trump, she went and did some field survey in Louisiana. Now, in Louisiana, the people who have been economically devastated, also actually not just even medically, that whole area has been poisoned by oil companies. And there's widespread cancer in that area. Yet, their anger is about the blacks and the Hispanics, immigrants and minorities. They say they are cutting the line. That's the expression they use. Now there, it is possible that cutting the line tells me that there will be both economic and culture. So it takes, they are suffering economically and they're taking it out on the minorities. But so in the US case, because the safety net is so patchy, but in Sweden, I think it's not bad. And the austerity policies. If austerity policies are mainly responsible, then why is it that in UK, the party that was particularly responsible for austerity policies, Tories, these people are voting for Tories. Brexit, they were voting for Brexit, which was brought about. They're not being angry about the party that brought about austerity policies. They're angry about immigrants, angry about other issues. And so immigration, I would say, is a major issue, cultural issue, primarily in the rich countries. In poor countries, culture being even more heterogeneous, other things. In India, the cultural issues really are just religiosity. And there, in religiosity, it is the Hindu majority. And this is the same, by the way, in Poland, Catholic nationalism. In India, it's Hindu nationalism. Poland is Catholic nationalism. In Turkey, it's Islamic nationalism. Turkey and Indonesia, it's Islamic nationalism. Now, in many of these cases, you create a cultural crisis. So, for example, in India, there is a majority, 80% of the population are Hindus, but the Hindu nationalists are creating a artificial besieged, as if the majority is the besieged community. And for example, in India, even upper class people will tell you that, you see, the Muslims are very soon going to outnumber us. 80% are Muslim, 14%. I can tell people, what kind of army is that will require that? More than that, I tell them, we're talking about the Muslim fertility rate being higher. On average, it is higher, particularly because they are poorer. But I said, look at the fertility rate in Kerala and the fertility rate in Hindu majority Uttar Pradesh. The Kerala Muslim woman's fertility rate is much lower than the Hindu woman's fertility rate in Uttar Pradesh. It's because the Kerala Muslim woman is more educated. So education of the mother is a primary determinant of the fertility rate, not religion. But that's not, what the Hindu cultural nationalist narrative emphasizes, and people buy that. And similarly, going back to rich countries, in France and also United States, there's what's called the Great Replacement Theory. The Great Replacement Theory is one day these immigrants are going to outnumber us. In fact, I don't know how many of you have seen, there's a French novel by a distinguished French author, Michel Houellebecq. He has a 2017 novel called Submission. Submission is about that dystopian day when France has become an Islamic republic. That's what they. So to me, so there. Yes, I think quite often, no doubt, is intertwined. But sometimes culture dominates, sometimes culture may be difficult.
So whichever it is, right? So you go about economic insecurity, cultural insecurity, and maybe they're sort of interrelated. One may outweigh the other. So one piece of the puzzle, which you were referring to earlier, is why the political groups that have been able to take advantage of this are sort of the right-wing authoritarian movements rather than the left, because you might have said, well, it's really the left that's supposed to be the encompassing kind of remedies, whether it's on certainly on the economic side, offering better policies for economic advancement for those at the bottom and the lower middle classes, and certainly culturally, which are supposed to be more encompassing as well. They should have been better positioned than the right to capitalize on these insecurities, and yet that's not what we've seen for the most part. Wow.
So that's actually the major question that I take up in the first half of the book before I go into policies. One, let me first say that there is quite a bit of co-optation going on, which is not so prominent in the United States, but outside the United States. By co-optation, I mean the right wing has been quite cleverly taken the wind out of the sail of the left on some of these issues. So, for example, with the United States is an exception. So, for example, the Republican Party here, the right-wing Republican Party here, has been opposing Biden's child assistance policies. But if you go to Poland, PIS, the right-wing, extreme right-wing party, they're an ardent supporter of child assistance policies. In Erdogan, he has done, I'm told, you can correct me, that done quite a bit in housing, health, policies for the poor. In India, Mr. Modi not merely continued some of the earlier policies of Food Security Act, earlier policies of Rural Employment Guarantee, which the earlier governments did, earlier policies of housing for the poor, but he introduced some new welfare policies. So I'm calling it co-optation to essentially cover that, in a sense, they're taking the wind out of the sail of the left. But that's only one small part. Second, what appeals, the populist demagogues appeal to the working class supporters by saying that they're anti-elite. In fact, all the time they're talking against, all these leaders talk about whether it's Orban or it's Modi or Trump, they're talking about or Bolsonaro. They were talking about by people, they're rousing people against the elite. The important question to ask, which elite? Not the financial elite. We don't hear them very much talking against the financial elite. They are much more talking about the liberal elite, the cultural elite. So, even in the United States, is the liberal East Coast, the two coastal liberals that work up the frenzy against. So yes, it's anti-elitist, but it's not that elite. Or the elite which appeases minorities, the elite that appeases the immigrants, the elite that appeases the sexual deviants, quote unquote. So that's the anger quite often is. The other thing I would say here, and to me, I spend a lot of time in the book on this, both in the diagnosis section and in the policy section, is I think that over time, the decline of trade unions played an important role in the inability of the left to be mobilized. To me, the main institutional resistance in earlier years to right-wing resurgence used to be the trade unions or trade union-like organizations. For various reasons, trade unions have been declining, not just in density, but generally. And there are some structural reasons. In fact, let me start with some reason with Dani was one of the first to point out in his early books on globalization that earlier trade unions and the corporate management were doing some kind of rent sharing because earlier the competition in international trade was much less than now. So in this rent sharing, trade unions got for labor some share. Over time, with competition increasing, particularly from China and Eastern Europe, those rents declined. And in the rent decline happened asymmetrically, and Dani's point, and a few other people also mentioned this. In this, labor lost out because while capital can creatively threaten to go elsewhere, labor does not have a correspondingly credible threat. But more than that, there were some structural changes going on. One was this, as with the knowledge economy, the blue collar worker, the division between the professional knowledge economy workers and the blue collar workers widened, not just in income, lifestyle, residence pattern, marriage patterns, is widened. Piketty calls them now the professional worker left calls them the Brahmin left. He mocks them as the Brahmin left. I think it's somewhat unfair because it so happens the Brahmin left is much more sympathetic to the marginalized workers, the minorities, immigrants, etc. The Brahmin left, not the non-Brahmin workers. But so that's a division. The other division is the occupational, namely earlier trade unions used to be very strong in the manufacturing and transportation sectors. And as the service economy gets more and more important all over the world, then there are important service workers' unions in the United States, as Canada, Europe, particularly in developing countries. Service workers are not organized. And even all over the world, in the COVID showed that many of the caregiving workers, which are in the service sector, were an underclass and underprotected. And the third kind of structural issue in the workers' organization is that, and this has been important in developing countries for a long time, much of the labor force is informal. In India, 80% of even the non-agricultural workers are informal. In Brazil, about 50% of workers are informal. And in the rich countries, the gig economy, workers' informal sector is increasingly important, even outside the gig economy. Even in Europe, where the workers have more protection, there are a large number of workers who don't have the protection. These are the temporary workers. A large number of temps, even in the factory sector, not just secretaries, etc. So there are a large number of informal workers. And this informal division also weakens the labor in its bargaining power. So for various reasons, trade unions become weaker over time, and in a sense, this has its cultural impact, in my judgment, also. Trade unions, to me, is not just an economic bargaining organization. I've been to European trade union festivals, cultural festivals organized by trade unions, left trade unions usually, but where culture was a very important part of it. And the whole thing was to make your identity as a worker, not as an ethnic group. So what has happened with the decline of trade unions is hollowed out a worker's sense of identity and belonging to an organization of workers. So there's been a cultural void where these demagogues have come in. And in the second part of my book, I talk about how trade unions, maybe in collaboration with civil society organization, sometimes even churches, particularly those churches who are active in the environmental causes, get together and do a kind of cultural rejuvenation. That's part of the cultural policies that I talk about, and essentially move away from this ethno-nationalistic things that demagogues are emphasizing. By the way, since I mentioned nationalism, can I just say one more thing and go back to you? Is that these demagogues use nationalism all the time. I already talked about the Hindu and Muslim nationalism. Bolsonaro used to use Christian evangelical and Poland Catholic nationalism. Putin uses Slavic nationalism. But there is, I think it's people somehow, we are allowing, liberals particularly, are allowing the cause of nationalism to be appropriated by these people. That's not the only kind of nationalism. In fact, there's a whole discussion. I have a whole chapter on nationalism. And I talk about other forms of nationalism, more liberal forms of nationalism. Sometimes it's called civic nationalism. In fact, those of you who know about the German philosopher Habermas talks about constitutional patriotism. And there are very interesting examples. In fact, he talks about generally, because he's trying to divert attention. He's German. Is divert attention from the blood and soil nationalism of the Germans, which has been very devastating. German source of nationalism. and now it's devastating in other countries, is blood and soil, or religion. So Habermas is saying, no, and let me give you an application of that to immigration policy. So one of the problems is liberals are supposed to be multicultural, and many of the workers don't like that, particularly the conservative workers don't like that. As it is already on issues like abortion, issues like gay rights, issues in this country, of course, peculiarly of gun rights, there's a division among workers. But then, on the issue of the nationalism, the ethnic identity, moving attention from ethnic identity to civic nationalism, where Habermas is saying that you don't have it fully multicultural in your policy toward immigrants. Multicultural is anything. You do this. In fact, there's a mocking description of multiculturalism: liberalism for liberals, cannibalism for cannibals. That's anything goes kind of multicultural. Habermas is against that. He says no. He's calling constitutional patriotism. As long as the immigrants keep to the liberal principles enshrined in the Constitution, then that should be multicultural with that very important purpose. So if a religious group wants to have hijab, no problem in this multiculturalism. If a religious group wants to do genital mutilation, then that's against the liberal principle of the Constitution. So it multiculturalism with particular modifications, as long as it's consistent with the liberal principles of the Constitution. I'm just giving that as an example. There are other forms of nationalism. Let me now give you to a more mundane kind of thing. I talk about in the book. Look at the soccer teams in Europe. The World Cup. The World Cup, when the soccer teams line up, half of the team are not white working class kids. They are quite often from immigrant or other ethnic groups. So, in general, but at the same time, there's a great deal of national pride about soccer teams. So here is a case of a kind of working class nationalism which is inclusive, which is proud, celebrates the diversity. In fact, I don't know how many of you know, in the Liverpool Football Club in England, they have one of the top scorers is Mohamed Saleh. He's an Egyptian, extremely devout Muslim player. Okay? And I read somewhere that I was not present, but apparently from the big, huge stadium, they chant for Saleh. And the chant for Saleh from largely white working class spectators goes like this: if he scores another few, I will be Muslim too. And this is from largely white. So that is, I'm not saying this is a dominant thing, but I'm saying it is possible to have national pride, combine that with celebrating diversity.
Prof, I want to give you a chance to say a little bit more about your ideas on rejuvenating social democracy and how sort of the social democracy of the future should be different from the way we understand social democracy of the past. You've talked about some of those that you will need to address some of these cultural anxieties and insecurities in a way that the left hasn't really always been successful at. But what are some of the key ideas under this rubric of rejuvenating social democracy that are sort of like new ideas and different ways of addressing things?
They're not really new, but I'm kind of putting together and reminding people. Of course, social democracy's main emphasis is in social insurance. It still has to be there, no doubt about that. But I, for example, spend quite a bit of time on voice of the workers in corporate governance. And there is now quite a bit of empirical evidence, particularly in Germany, the German Works Council In fact, I read up the literature on German Works Council. We have observational data and now also experimental data. Yes. That workers' councils are not merely improves the voice of the workers, including women's voice in the corporate governance, but also it's not at the expense of it improves productivity, but it's not at the expense of profits. And in Germany, if you take the large companies, most of these large companies, the majority or almost majority of the corporate governing board are worker representatives. And this has been going on for quite some time, so there is a lot of empirical data on this. So what I just now said about productivity and profits is from the German Works Council literature. Now, in this country, of course, that's almost absent, and in the last presidential primary election, Elizabeth Warren, a local politician, brought this up repeatedly, that workers' voice in the corporate governance. Now, why is that important apart from the workers' dignity, from the point of view of workers' dignity and autonomy? I think if the workers have an important voice in corporate governance, the decision to outsource, the decision to relocate workers will have a voice, and that will take have some role in the economic policies. And then something that Baron emphasizes a lot about we should have to redirect R&D of a company. The research and development of a company at the moment is largely toward labor replacing. And there are ways, I think this is what Baron emphasized quite a bit, that there are ways of directing innovations toward labor absorbing, labor empowering. We are not doing it now. So if workers have a voice, an important voice in corporate governance, they will have an important voice in the way R&D takes place in the company. Thirdly, if workers have a voice in corporate governance, one of the complaints of workers of international trade agreements and investment agreements was that corporate lobbies do all the influencing, what those rules would be, what those treaties would be. All these years, it's the corporate lobbies who have really quite often even written the rules. If workers have voice in companies, in the corporate sector, they will be able to influence, they should be able to influence those international trade agreements, international investment agreements, and that will reduce the disenchantment that the rank and file workers have about international trade, about international investment. So I've already given examples in which corporate voice will affect the economic policies of companies. And of course, as I mentioned, I've specified cultural role of these workers. The other way is the organization of the workers. United States and India, the worker organization is extremely decentralized. And that reduces labor bargaining power. And I think at least sectoral, if worker in Europe, sometimes the level of workers, the organization is at the sectoral level or the industrial level, and that in fact would reduce the opposition that in this country, for example, even at the farm level, the amount of scorched earth anti-union policy that United States you see will diminish a little if it's at the sectoral level, and that also can have effect on macroeconomic policies, etc.
You have perhaps a very interesting serialized memoirs on the what is it, the Three Quarks Daily, is this Indian online magazine.
It's not Indian.
It's not Indian.
It's New York based.
It is New York based. Yes. And so I would really recommend those of you who are interested to look them up. I think there's 65 of them now, or is it
about? But a completely revised version. One with the reason I serialized, I got feedbacks all the time. So it's thoroughly revised now. HarperCollins is going to bring it out by the end of this year. I don't know, around end of September. So if you are interested, it's called, the first word is a Sanskrit word, Charaivati, means move along. And the subtitle is an academic's global journey. And in fact, there are lots of anecdotes if you're interested.
They are very interesting because once you start looking at it, it's almost impossible to stop. And it's so fascinating. I noticed in one point there that you make a point about economics and whether economists should say much about policy. And you declare that kind of, have be feeling very ambivalent about saying anything about policy because you thought that maybe sort of your advantage or the advantage of economists is really to sort of say something about the world as it works, but not get too much into policy. Yet here you are in the Kennedy School of Government, and I force you to. And in fact, the newest book is a lot about policy, as you were talking about. So I'm glad that maybe between episode number, 48 and today, your ideas might have changed a little bit on that. But let's see if there are any questions, comments from the audience.
So Pranab, thank you for the comments. Always interesting. I was just reflecting on your comments on the trade union, thinking about the cooperative movement. I just happened to have a long conversation with this fellow, Sodi, who ran Amul for 45 years. This is the largest dairy cooperative. And my sort of anecdotal understanding or cursory look at the data on productivity and so on, as well as competition with large dairy cooperatives, Fonterra in New Zealand, or the European ones, is that Amul always comes out ahead. So it seems to be an alternative data point to support your contention that some form of organization need not be union-based.
I very much agree. In fact, I forgot to mention, I emphasize trade unions, but trade union is just an example. I say that, in fact, I do talk about cooperatives too, but not great deal. But I say that there are a lot of these intermediate associations between the citizen and the state and the market. So these are non-market, non-state associations. And trade union is one of them, but cooperative is another. This sociologist who's unfortunately had an untimely death, Eric Olin Wright, used to have what he called a real utopia project. At the moment may be utopian, but it is a viable, and if people pay enough attention, it is possible to. And he has several volumes, by the way. And one volume is on democracy and associations. And the association they're thinking of, trade unions, cooperatives, parent-teacher associations, women's groups, neighborhood associations. So they have a whole range of these intermediate. We economists don't usually talk about them quite often. We usually talk about the state, the market. But there are these intermediate whole layers of this association where it is possible to, in a sense, reconcile efficiency and equity. So yeah, I'm very much with you.
Professor Bardhan, I think Professor Rodrik and Professor Khawaja drilled into us that policy and politics are often at odds with each other, and all policies need to be politically supportable for it to be a policy. So I think I'm struggling to understand why would shareholders give up their power in the board of companies, because they have the power of collective action. I mean, they can organize and ensure that legislation in that manner does not go through. So how do you foresee something, a change like this would come about?
Very tough. But in fact, this is the note at which I end my book. After I talk all these policies, I said all these are easier said than done. And the whole, if you want me to describe my attitude there, I call it, in fact, in the beginning of the book, I call it, my attitude is what I would describe as upbeat skepticism. Namely, you push for some things knowing very well it cannot work. But that shouldn't be discouraged to not for. Antonio Gramsci talked about optimism of the will, but pessimism of the intellect, because that sometimes things don't work. But going back to your thing about why, but Germany, Germany is a capitalist country. It's in fact, unfortunately, most of the capitalist discussion is too much Anglo-American. There's varieties, the labor-friendly capitalism, Scandinavian capitalism, German capitalism is more labor-friendly. They're not less capitalist, therefore. And as I said, in Germany, it's a large companies, which the majority now are workers. But it cannot happen in one day. Germany has a long tradition of that. It requires social movements. And many of these things, going back to something that Dani referred to, my skepticism of policy advice. I'm not against other people giving policy advice. In my whole long professional career, I've often been asked to give policy advice, and I felt a little ambiguous, skeptical. Particularly if once I was asked whether I want to be the World Bank Vice President, Chief Economist, I said, no way. I have said no. I've said no to such things in India, a country I know a little bit about, and now for the whole world, the developing world, if I have to advise what kind of policies they should policies, I kind of retreat a little. Particularly because I've seen that.
You weren't thinking in general. If you weren't doing it, somebody else would.
Yes, because they probably have a better idea about different countries' context than I do. Because I see, in fact, I've seen very close quarters how policies are made in India, and it's we economists have no idea the way the actual policy works. It's a world of intrigues and counter-intrigues and political pressures and so on. I'm not advising any of you in the Kennedy School not to do policy. I'm just saying I personally feel a little hesitant in giving. In spite of that, half of the book is on policies, but it's on a different level. It's not the actual implementation. That's why what about the real utopia project of my late friend Eric Olin Wright. Yes, but I agree with you that the opposition would be very strong, no doubt. And that's where the trade unions used to provide a countervailing power. And that countervailing power is declining. And it's true, in this country, which is very much anti-union, it's one of among the rich countries, one of the most anti-union countries is the United States. The only way trade unions by themselves cannot fight. It's not just Starbucks, etc., where they're gradually coming up. But for a general movement, you have to ally with community groups, you have to ally with civic associations, and I often think a strike should be associated with the civil disobedience. So, in order to get trade unions to rise up in this country, they have to associate with other social forces.
I think we have time for one final question.
You have a student.
Raghu Rajan was arguably braver or more foolish than you in that he accepted the position as chief economist at the
Rob is a
IMF.
good friend. Good luck to him. He's already done his Bank of India, and he can tell you the pressures that he faced. But I thought for a moment that Raghu has a book on third pillar. Okay. One of my chapters is actually addressing that where I agree with Raghu, that why the community is important, but where I disagree with him on their problems. Sorry, I probably interrupted you.
One of the areas where you agree is the emphasis on decentralization of governance. Could you expand on that, please?
Yes. In fact, there is a small section on decentralization. For the last 2-3 decades now, Philippe Mukherjee and I several papers on this, both theoretical and empirical papers. So what we've been doing, empirical part, decentralization utilizes local information and local ingenuity, that's its strength. The weakness that we emphasize, and we have collected data and done some political economy analysis and published those papers. If you're interested, go to my website. Some of those papers are there. Is that for quite often the local organizations are easier to capture by the vested interests. This local, if you're thinking of agriculture, the rural sector, local landlords capture those so-called decentralized organizations. Central organizations can be captured, but center at least there are competing interest groups. The local level is that not competition is much less, so it's easily captured. By the way, this is mentioned even in this country in 1776, Federalist Papers. James Madison is worries about the local capture. I think for Dani, Dilip and I once wrote an ER proceedings thing that you were organizing many years back. So I quoted their Federalist Papers. So there are problems of decentralization. So we collected data from about 90 villages, random sample villages in West Bengal in India, and detailed surveys of both economic characteristics, demographic characteristics, and political characteristics. These are how the local governments function, and then we surveyed households and organized straw polls on various issues, how would they vote in the straw poll. And so then we've analyzed what kind of things they do. This was a time when the local government was decentralization proceeded quite a bit. Now it's gone. Modi is centralizing everything. So decentralization almost gone, except the state of Kerala. There's hardly any real decentralization.
I think the greatest difficulty of giving a book talk is that you want to say enough that people get interested, but not so much that they feel they know what's in the book. So I think you've managed that difficulty extremely well. So thank you very much, Pranab, for being here with us.